Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Harav, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, Shavua Tov.
Shavuot Tov.
Here we go.
Shabbat Tov. Rabbi, don't forget to share on Facebook. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for reminding me. I almost forgot. Oh boy. Okay. Okay, so we're finishing up the laws of Purim here. Bezat Hashem, and then we'll get to the laws of Matzot. Bezat Hashem, maybe tomorrow. We'll see. So it says like this in the Torah. Some say that the Avel, the mourner, should not go to the synagogue. He should read in his house. Some say like that. Also Chatan, right? Who's the one who had the wedding? He shouldn't go to synagogue. He should read the Megillah. He should read the Megillah at home also. ואדוני ראש בייף, yeah, so ואדוני אבי ז"ל כתב כדברי הר"ם מרוטנבורג. So he says the Rosh wrote like the Ram. So what's the bottom line here? That, as we said, right, that the Ram, Rabbi Moshe Mirotenberg, he says that we don't nullify the mourning on Purim. But it says at the same time we don't really do mourning. Not 14, not 15. Only things which are in private. So after he prays in the house of the mourner on Purim, then he goes to synagogue. Right, so some say he goes to hear the Megillah. That's what says the Rami Rotenburg. He goes to hear the Megillah in the synagogue. But there's another opinion that says, as we just mentioned now, that he should read it at home. And so says the Tur that the Rosh Paskin like Rabbi Moshe Mirotenburg. Okay, that's it. That's the Tur. So let's see the Bet Yosef. So it says here that he brings the Rokeach. It says that Purim Shechal Yot Motzi Shabbat. If Purim falls out on Motzi Shabbat, which is Saturday night. והירא שום אבל קודם לפורים, והאבל יושב בבית הכנסת, and there came out to be some kind of a mourning before Purim, and the mourner sits in the synagogue, בשבת המנחה, כשיש שם לא יוצא and he's there, he shouldn't go out. וישב שם, וישמע כל התפילה מהמגילה ולמחרת. He should hear all the prayers and the Megillah, and then tomorrow, the next day, לא יצא מתך ביתו, he should stay home, אלא קוראים לו המתפללים עמו, או קורא בעצמו. So what happens is that he reads it by himself, or the people who are the prayers read with him. Also, if it falls the Purim on the middle of the week, Amrinan b'moed katan, we say that over there in Moed Katan, Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, Avel eno yotzeh mipetach beto, that Avel should not go out of his house. So that's good. Let's see the Shulchan Aruch. And then we said, right, that if Imchal Purim, Motzi Shabbat, if Purim falls on Motzi Shabbat, Ve'avel Yosef Bet HaKnesset, and the mourner is sitting in the synagogue, בשבת, on Shabbat, mincha time, לא יצא משם עד שיתפלל תפילת ערבית. So what should he do? Let him first pray Arvit, right? He shouldn't leave there until he does Arvit. וישמע קריאת המגילה, and hear the Megillah. ומחרת לא יצא מפתח ביתו. And then the next day, the following day, which is Purim, on Sunday, he shouldn't leave his house. So what does that mean? He should read the Megillah at home. Just the way he does it here in the Shulchan Aruch. That's the way he arranges it here. Just like we saw in the Turim Bet Yosef. So why is it this way? What's the reason why we do it this way? Because what happens is that he's already in shul on Shabbat. So if you're already there, might as well stay, and hear the Megillah. And then you go home, and then day after, since you're already home, you don't go to shul. Why not? Because you're a mourner, right? So you don't go to shul, and so therefore what you do is you read the Megillah at home. Any questions? Otherwise, we'll go on. Let's go to Vav. Okay, interesting that the Vav, there's no Vav in Bet Yosef. So let's see what we have in the Shulchan Aruch. So it says in the Shulchan Aruch here, יש מי שאומר שהאבל חייב לשלוח מנות. Interesting. Wow. I don't know why we don't have this in the. Yeah, so it's in the Torah. Let's see in the Torah. So it says in the Torah like this. Right? So the Avel, the mourner, has to do also sending the food, right? The portions of food to his fellow Jew. He has to do that too. Even though he's mourning, and even though he's home, right? He's not going to the shul, doesn't matter. He still should do the mitzvah of Mishloach Manot. So that's what it says in the Shulchan Aruch here. Let's see in the Shulchan Aruch. That it says, right, יש מי שאומר שהאבל חייב לשלוח מנות. As we said, that there is an opinion that says the Avel the mourner has to send also the gifts of the food. And it says in the Ramah, אבל אין שולחין לאבל כל י' בית חודש. But he says we don't send to the Avel though, right? In other words, even though the Avel, the mourner, does send the gift, but we don't send it to him because he's a mourner. וכמו שהתבהר בי"ד בסימן ש"פ, like we're going to explain over there in your idea, אין שם. אין בעיר אלא האבל עם אחר, חייב לשלוח כדי לשלוח מנות. So he says something interesting, right? The Rama. What about if you have only in that town 2 Jews, right? And one of them is Avel, one of them is a mourner. So then they should send to each other. Why? Because they have nobody else, to send to. So therefore, right, in order to do the mitzvah of Mishloach Manot, so the only way you can do it is by sending it to the Avel, right? So therefore you should do it. That's what we're saying. Okay. That's Vav. Then we'll go to Zayin. So it says here in Zayin, in the Bet Yosef, Katab Berachot Chaim, it says in this book, Haonen mutar lebasar v'yain, delo ate aseh deyachid ve'avedut v'dache aseh dvarim derabim deraita mismoach beponim divrei kabbalah ninu shem ki divrei Torah. So he says something interesting that right. The truth is, right, that there's 2 types of classifications when it comes to a mourner. We have the onen and we have the avel. So the onen, what's the difference between the onen and the avel? The onen is the mourner before the burial, right, of the dead. That's called onen. And then the avel is after the burial. He's called avel. Right? That's the difference between one and the other. So he says here that in general, right, the rule is like this. Onen, before the burial, you're not allowed to have meat or drink wine, right? But here in this case, because it's Purim, he says he is allowed to. Why? Why is that? Because you have here contradiction, right? You have the positive commandment of the onen, who was the mourner before the burial. So that doesn't come and push aside the positive commandment of sending the gifts to your fellow Jew. So therefore, right, one doesn't push aside the other. There's a rule like this, right, in halakha, in Torah, in the Talmud, it's brought down that the positive commandment pushes aside a negative commandment. So if there's 2 contradictory commandments, right, one is positive, one is negative, the positive comes and pushes aside the negative. But here, in this particular case, they're both positive commandments. So therefore, one doesn't push aside the other. And this is the reason why that in this case, right, you're allowed to have meat and wine. Why is that? Because since it's Purim, right, and you're allowed to, have your seudah, your meal, Purim meal, right, which is meat and wine. That's like the good stuff, right, that you're supposed to have. So it's a positive commandment to do that, to eat that seudah on Purim. It's also a positive commandment for the onen, right, the mourner, before the burial, not to have meat and wine. So therefore, right, comes one doesn't push aside the other. So therefore, you're allowed to have it, even though he's onen. In this particular case, that's the idea. Okay, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch there. The Shulchan Aruch. יש מי שאומר שאונן מותר בבשר היין. Some say you're allowed, right, the onen, the mourner before the burial, is allowed to have meat and wine. Because it doesn't, right here, the positive commandment of abelut, of mourning, doesn't come and push aside something which is a positive commandment for, right, to be happy on Purim. The divrei kabbalah ninu, because as we said, right, these are words of Kabbalah. What does that mean? That these are prophetic commandments given by the prophets. So it's stronger than the rabbinic, it resembles the Torah. So therefore, right, in this case, it doesn't come and push aside one the other. So therefore, the rule is, right, according to this, that you're allowed to have meat and wine on Purim, even though he's an onen, right? That means he's a mourner who hasn't buried the dead.
I'm not sure I understand how him not being permitted to have meat and wine is a positive commandment. Isn't that a negative one?
Yeah, well, it really depends on how it's structured, right? The commandment. You know what I mean? In other words, depends on how the commandment was said. Was it said in a positive way or a negative way? So here, apparently, it's a positive commandment, meaning to say, right, that let me try to describe it in a more clear way, right? That the rule is like this, that when you're onen, you haven't buried the dead yet. So Hashem tells you, right, in a case like that, that you're commanded in a positive manner. Okay, I don't know how to say this, right? In a positive manner, you're commanded not to have those things, right? Meat and wine. So, right, it all depends on how the commandment is phrased, right? In other words, what's a negative commandment? How is it phrased? Do not, right? Do not do this. Do not do that, right? If you phrase it like that, it's called a negative commandment. You know what I mean? But if you phrase it in a positive way, it's called a positive commandment. So it depends on the phrasing,
Kavod Harav, what would be an example of a positive commandment? Allowed or not allowed, or is it?
Put tefillin, right? You gotta put tefillin. That's positive.
Okay.
So
And the negative, I mean, not that it is, but for the sake of
the truth is, that I don't offhand right now. I don't know the how this is positive. In other words, I don't have the language here, to show you, how it's phrased in a positive way. Maybe we'll see, but it depends. It depends on the phrasing. You know what I mean? How you phrase it.
If it says something like, the onan will abstain from eating meat or will avoid eating meat or something like that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That would be like positive. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not a do not, right? It's do, right? Do you should abstain. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Something like that, right?
Okay. And now it's more. Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you.
So it all depends on the phrasing.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Kavod Harav.
yes. But okay. So but the truth is that if it wasn't, but here, what are we trying to say? What we're saying is that the positive commandment of this one doesn't push aside the positive commandment of the other one. But if the truth is, right, if the onen, right, the morning was a negative commandment, so then it would be even more clear, that it's allowed, because the positive commandment of doing the seudah would push aside the negative commandment of mourning. So that would be even better. You know what I mean? That's the whole thing. Okay, whatever. It's all technical, It's a technical issue. So anyway, let's see the Rama. So he says, right, so it's all the more so, he says, right, that he would be obligated to do the reading Megillah, and also the prayers and Kriyat Shema. Why? Because those are all positive. Interesting. Here the Dafka Belayla, so that's only at night, he says. Even though the dead is, placed before him. But when it comes to the daytime, that he wants to bury, right, the dead. So then he says, then the burial comes first. Like we explained above. So he says, first you read the Megillah, and then you pray, right? And then afterwards, זה לא עדיף מיום טוב ושבת. It's not any better than יום טוב ושבת. כמו שנתברר ליל סימן עין א', כנ"ל. Okay, so I'll read the Rama again. It's a little bit confusing, the language here. בכל שכן שחייב במקרא מגילה. All the more so, says the Rama, right? That he is liable to read the Megillah and Tefillah and Kriyat Shema. All these things he's liable to do. So what does that mean? That since these are all, positive commandments, right? So the positive commandment of not of being a mourner will not push aside these things. Why is that? Because it's Purim, right? If it wasn't Purim, that would be a different story altogether. You know what I mean? Because the truth is, right, that in general, a mourner, right, on the first day, the onen, right, before the burial, the rule is that before the burial, you're absolved from Kriyat Shema, and you're absolved from prayers before the burial. But here, you're not absolved. Why? Because since it's Purim, right? So it pushes aside. It gets pushed aside because of Purim. So it's like a holiday. So it pushes aside the mourning. At least, right, the public mourning, right? As we said, right? It depends on if it's private or public. So if it's public mourning, something like in the community, right? So then it gets pushed aside. But things which are private, just between you and God, right, at home, those things are not pushed aside. So therefore, says the Rama, when would that apply? At night. Because at that point, right, at night, you haven't buried your dead yet. He's still not buried. But it's when it's in the daytime, he says Shirotzila Kovro, that he already wants to bury him in the daytime. Kurat meto kodem kemo. So then the burial comes before all these other things, right? Okay, interesting. So he says, therefore, what you do is you first read the Megillah and then you pray. Because it's not any better than Yom Tov and Shabbat, which comes out to be the same thing. Not any stronger than that. Like we explained in the Siman. Okay, so anyway, right? Let me just make sure we got this right. Yeah, okay, more or less, that's the idea. If you have any questions, let me know. The language of the Ramah is not so clear, by the way. There's a lot of questions here regarding the language of the Ramah. Why it comes out that way, but I'm not going to get into it right now because, we don't really have this issue of mourning right now. So, it's not something so practical. Okay. But anyway, maybe we should look at the Mishnah Berurah just, to see how he explains it. Interesting. Yeah, so I'm going to read this Mishnah Berurah. He explains it pretty well, actually. He says here like this, right? Regarding what the Rama said. So he says, he wants to say like this to Rama, that since that regarding, right, the mitzvah of rejoicing on Purim, to have a rejoicing on Purim, because of that, we push aside the positive commandment of mourning. And so therefore, what we say is, right, that we allow him to have meat and wine. So he says, for sure, it's not proper to absolve him at night mimikra megillah, from reading the Megillah, because of this reason. So he says, regarding the other mitzvot, since it's not the way to bury him, at that point, in other words, they don't bury him at night. So it resembles like onen, mourner, on the second night of Yom Tov. That a lot of poskim obligate him in mitzvot because of this reason. So he says, but there is some, right, objection here. One thing he says is that the second night of Yom Tov, there are opinions regarding the poskim. The Shem al kol panim, the Shem al panim Yom Tov who says there it's at least Yom Tov. So therefore, right, the mourning doesn't take effect yet, because it's not the way to bury him at night. So it's not so when it comes to Purim, that the main simcha, the main right rejoicing, it's during the daytime, the main rejoicing. So it says, and the night just resembles any other night, shel chol, weekday. So therefore, the mourning does take effect. As says, even though that's not the way to bury him at night, so therefore he wrote, he says, right, he writes that at night of the 14th, he should hear them reading the Megillah me'acher, from someone else. Okay, well, it's a whole discussion, but we'll go on to the next chapter. Right, so just to recap that, right, sorry, I keep on dwelling on this, but to recap this whole thing, right, with the Rama, what he's trying to say, right, according to Mishnah Berurah, the way he explained it is like this, is that at night, he should do the mitzvot. So what does that mean? When you're onen, in general, right, person who's a mourner, hasn't buried the dead yet. So the rule is, right, that he's absolved from all the mitzvot until he buries the dead. So because of that, it says the Rama, at night, it's not really the way to bury him at night. They don't bury at night. So therefore, the rule is you have to do the mitzvot at night, because you're not absolved yet. Why aren't you absolved? Because you haven't buried him yet. You can't bury him at night. You can't. There's no way to do it there at that time, at that point. So since the obligation of burial doesn't take effect at night, so therefore you're not absolved from the mitzvot. That's what he's saying. And therefore at night you should do all the mitzvot. But, so he says, but in the daytime, where now you can already bury him, there's the possibility to bury him, right, in the daytime. So there, what you should do is first bury him, and then do the rest right afterwards. The burial comes first. Why is that? Because it's already time, for the burial at the daytime. At night, you can't do it. So then, the daytime, since you are able to bury him, so therefore you are absolved from the mitzvot until you bury him. So therefore you should bury him first, and then do the rest of the mitzvot afterwards, right? That's the idea. Because once you bury him, you're not called anymore onen. You're not called anymore, right, this classification of a mourner before the burial. Okay. Let's go on to the next chapter. So it says in the Torah, in the next chapter, Yom Yud Dalet V'Tet Vav Shebe'adar Rishon Mutarim Be'esped V'Tanit. So he says, this, by the way, is relevant for this year, right? Because now we're going into the first month of Adar. There's 2 months of Adar. It's a leap year. So you're talking about the first month of Adar, right? In a leap year. That's exactly what we have now. When is it going to be? The Rosh Chodesh? It's going to be Friday and Shabbat, right? Rosh Chodesh. And so this is exactly what we're talking about. This first month of Adar. So it says, right, that since it's only the first month of Adar, not the second one, which is the main one, so therefore you are allowed to do eulogy and fasting, right? Since it's not the second month of Adar, it's only the first month, which is not the real Purim time. So he says, that which we say, right, that the 14th and 15th of the first Adar and second Adar are equal when it comes to eulogizing and fasting. That's only if they read the Megillah. And then what happened was, right, that they read the Megillah, and then they all of a sudden decided, you know what? I think we should make a leap year, right? Add another Adar. We don't do that today, but today we don't do it this way because it's a fixed calendar we have. But in those days, right, they could still decide to make it a leap year, like, just on demand, or whatever, if they needed it. So they could decide, like, on the spot, to do a leap year. But this, this time nowadays we don't do that. Anyway, that's the way it comes out to be. But if they didn't read the Megillah in the first month of Adar, then we say, right, that you're allowed to do eulogy and fasting in the first month of Adar. It says in this book, so it says they're forbidden to do eulogy and fasting on all the years, even though they didn't read the Megillah. So there's 2 different opinions here regarding that. That's why it comes up from the Rambam. He says, also the Rif, like that, Zal, also he says, right, that you have to have some more seudah, some more meals, also, like to do better meals, on Yudal on the 14th of on the 14th. But he says the 15th you don't have to, only the 14th. So he says the Rosh writes like the first opinion. He goes according to the first opinion. Okay, that's the whole tour, right? Beginning to end. So let's see the Bet Yosef. So it says Bet Yosef here. What's the source for all this? First parak of Megillah, Vav Amud Bet. Tanan. We learned in the Mishnah. Karu Megillah be'Adar Rishon. Let's say if they read the Megillah in the first Adar, as we said, right, in our times it doesn't happen, but it could happen theoretically, when you have the Beddin, right, making the Rosh Chodesh every month. And then, right, they made a leap year all of a sudden. They decided to do a leap year, right, to do an extra Adar. Korinota be'Adar Sheni. So then what we do is we read it again in the second Adar as well, right, to the Megillah, because the first one was kind of like nullified, canceled, whatever, right? It was ואין ביד אדר ראשון לאדר שני, and there's no difference between first Adar and second Adar, אלא בקיאת המגילה, only the reading of the Megillah, לבד, only the reading of the Megillah. מתנות רבים, also the gifts to the poor, ובגמרא, בברייתא, the Gemara, it says in the Braita, Shama ifligu tanaya b'milta, that the Tanaim, right, the Chachamim of the Mishnah argued about this. Musayim ba v'shabin be'esped v'tanit. So the conclusion is, right, that when it comes to eulogy and fasting, she'asurin b'zeh b'zeh, that they're forbidden in both months. In that particular case, Katav Rosh v'shabin be'esped v'tanit, the asurin b'zeh b'zeh. So he says, right, that the Rosh says that regarding eulogy and fasting, they're forbidden in both months. Berush im kara'u Megillah b'yom daled. That means that if they read the Megillah on the 14th, ubo bayom ibru hashana, and then they decide to make it into a leap year, asur be'esped v'tanit. So then you're not allowed to do eulogy and fasting. But b'shar shana milbet. But it says it seems to. But when it comes to other leap years, in other words, when it's not like that, when they didn't make it all of a sudden, right, the decision to make a leap year in the right, right away. They didn't decide to do it right in a flash. Nireli shemutar be'esped. So then it will be allowed to do right eulogy and tanit and fasting. So that's the way it comes out in the tour. אלא שכתב אבל אם לא קראה מגילה ממקום אבל בשאר שנה מעוברת והכל. So he says, right, that rather, right, but he wrote אם if they didn't read the Megillah, right, במקום אבל בשאר, but it says when it comes to the remainder שנה מעוברת, when it comes to other leap years, והכל אחד כשעודים קודם לכן שהשנה מעוברת. So it says when they know that it's a leap year, they already know. ודאי שאינם קוראים את המגילה בי"ד, so they're not going to read the Megillah on the 14th of the ט"ו, the 15th שבאדר ראשון of the first Adar. ופשוט הוא says it's obvious שמה שכתבו הראש ורבנו, that was Rosh and Rabbeinu wrote, ובו ביום נראה להם לעבר השנה. They all of a sudden, right, decided to make a leap year. היינו משום דאם לא נראה, it says because that if it doesn't seem right to them, להם עד אחר אותו יום, until after that day, פשיטא דאסור בהספד ותענית, then it's going to be for sure, right, it's obvious that it's going to be forbidden to do eulogy and fasting. שמאחר שבאותו יום לא היה בדעתם לעבר, because since on that day they weren't thinking to make it into a leap year, אבל באותו יום כשאר שנים פשוטות, so it's considered to be on that day like any other year. כתבו בהגות מימוניות. Says right in this book, והמורדכי יוסף מורדכי, שהר"ם כתב כדברי הראש, the Ram wrote like the Rosh, אבל הרמב"ם כתב סתם, but the Rambam writes, ושני הימים אסורים בהספד ותענית. He says that in both right times, you're not allowed to do eulogy and fasting. באדר הראשון, whether it's the first Adar, ובאדר השני, second Adar, כתבו הגאות, says in the הגאות, שכן פסק בסגמג, that's how Paskins in the Samag, וכן דעת הר"ן, also the Ran, וכתב שקרוב הדבר גם כן, שראוי להרבות בסעודה ביום ד' בראשון, אבל says also there's, it's proper to have some seudah, right, on the 14th, on the first month. אבל לעניין לשלוח מנות, but it says when it comes to sending gifts, right, food gifts, כיוון דדמו למתנות לאביונים, since it resembles the issue of giving money to the poor, תלתנו אלא בשני, that's only in the second month, משמע נמי שאף בשלוח מנות אינה אלא בשני. So then it implies that also regarding sending the food, right, to your fellow Jew, it's also in the second month only. והתוספות, כתבו, it says בתוספות, ויש נוהגים לעשות ימי משתה ושמחה ב-15 של אדר ראשון. So some do also, right, the rejoicing also on the 14th and 15th of the first month. וריחתא דמתניתין נמי משמע כן. So he says that's the way it implies in the Mishnah. כדקאמר אלא מקרא מגילה, like it says, right, that regarding the reading the Megillah בלבד, ומתנות לעניים, and also the gifts to the poor, מכלל דעניין המשתה ומשמחה, but when it comes to rejoicing, in other words, the סעודה, זה וזה שווים, they're equal, ולא נהרד, so it says that doesn't seem right. דאמרינן בגמרא, because we say in the Gemara, לעניין הספד ותענית, זה וזה שווים. When it comes to, right, eulogy and fasting, they're equal. Mikal the simcha, so it comes out that when it comes to simcha, which is the seudah, umishte lekas, there is no right We don't have that. So that's halacha, he says. What that's halacha? That we don't have to do the seudah on the first month of Adar. So therefore, right, what does that mean for us? It means that this month, right, coming month now, where it's the first month of Adar, we're not going to do all of these things, right? We're not going to read the Megillah. We're not going to, right, do the seudah. We're not going to do any of these things. That's what it means. Right? When it comes to this book, he says, Katav v'shem asmak. He writes in the name of this book, She'olam lo nahagu la'asot mishteh v'simcha ki'im b'yud dalad b'shebei Adar Rishon. So he says they only do, right, the seudah on the 14th of the first of Adar. Af al pi shebei Adar hasheni nahagu ken b'tetvav. Even though in the second month, right, they do it on the 15th. Simcha mishteh, they do the seudah. V'tama Mishum says, what's the reason why? Mishum the Amar Talmuda, because the Talmud said En ben Yudal Shebadar Rishon, because the Talmud says, right, that the only difference between the first one and the second one is the right or the mitzvot that we mentioned. But lo iskir tetvav, he didn't mention it to 16, 15. I'm sorry. The Shema nakat oto shehu ikar. So he says maybe he only took right. He only chose the one which is the main. When it comes to doing labor, though, there's no prohibition in the first month of Adar. Because also the second month he says there's no prohibition. Only in a place where there's a custom to do so. So he says nowadays, right, as I just told you, right, there's no custom anymore to do a special seudah in the first month of Adar, whether it's the 14th or the 15th. We don't do. But anyway, right, either way, we don't do supplications, whether it's the first month or the second month, on the 14th and 15th. Also, we don't say this Tehillim, right, on that day. Why is that? Because it's a day of miracles and salvation, right? So therefore, we leave out all kinds of sad things, which are said in the Tehillim. We don't say those things because after all, they are days of salvation. Okay, very good. So that's Bet Yosef. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch. It looks like we skipped something here, the chapter before, but I'll get back to that in a second. Let me just first do the Shulchan Aruch on what we just did now. So it says in the Shulchan Aruch here, Yom Yudal Tetvav Shebei Adar Rishon, as we said, right? When it comes to the first month of Adar, right, as we have this year, right? Whether it's the 14th or the 15th of the month, en noflim al panem. So we don't do supplication, because after all, right, it's like it's the days of rejoicing. We don't do also this Tehillim, right, which is talking about affliction, right, days of affliction. So therefore we skip that. And also you're not allowed to do. So he says, right, that you're not allowed to do eulogizing and fasting on that day, in those days, even though it's only the first month. But he says when it comes to other mitzvot, right, we're not accustomed to do them on the first month of Adar. Some say you're allowed to also do, right, eulogizing and fasting. So it seems like the halakha is like the first opinion. So he says, right, that's what the Ramah says also. The custom is like the first opinion. So what does that mean? We don't do eulogizing and fasting on the first month either. on the 14th and 15th. Some say also, right, that you should do also some, right, seudah on the 14th of the first month. And so he says, but the but he says the custom is not like that, as we said, right? The custom is not like that. So therefore, we don't do any seudah on the first month, right? The 14th and 15th. No seudot over there. No meals. No drinking, right? None of that stuff. Okay. But he says it's a good idea, to do a little bit extra, when it comes to seudah, in order to fulfill the stringent opinion. So he says it's good to be rejoicing, why not? Nothing wrong with it, right? So a little bit extra doesn't hurt you. Okay, so that's the end of that chapter. So now what we'll do is we'll go back to the we'll go back to the chapter before to do something we skipped there. Eight het. This one. Okay, so it says like this right here. In the Beit Yosef. Katav Rashba, says the Rashba, Shalta im mutar lisa isha bepurim, right? There's a question. Are you allowed to get married on Purim, right? That's the question. Are you allowed to hold a wedding? Mistabra shehu mutar. So says Rashba, right? It's reasonable to say that it's allowed, to get married on Purim. Because it says, right, you should rejoice on your holiday. So he says, right, with your holiday and not your wife. But Purim mutar. But Purim is allowed. So you understand what he's saying? What he's saying is like this, right? That there's a rule like this that you're not allowed to get married on the festivals. Purim, which is what? Not Purim, but Pesach, Sukkot and Shavuot, right? We don't get married on those festivals. Because you should celebrate one thing and not two, right? Together. In other words, you should celebrate your holiday and not celebrate your being with your wife. So you shouldn't do two of them together. But he says Purim is different. Why? Because Purim is not really a festival, like those three holidays. It's not from the Torah, like so. Therefore, right, the rule is that you are allowed to get married on Purim. So you can do a wedding on Purim. I don't see anybody doing it, by the way. You're going to be hard pressed to find somebody who does a wedding on Purim. But technically speaking, it's allowed. That's what he's saying, right? Whatever. Okay. So it's only one day, right? Purim. So וכמן דאמר משום פריאה ורבייה ועניינה אלו הולכים בהן להקל מדרבנן הם. So since they're rabbinical, these things, we go right lenient. So therefore, right, says the Rashba, you want to get married on Purim, be my guest, right? No problem. You're allowed to do it. So then he goes on to say, ואסור בהספד בתענית ביום טוב ט"ו ולבני כרכים וערות כשתיהן אסורות בשניהם כבר נתבהר בסמוך, right? So we also said, right, that whether it's the 14th or the 15th of the month of Purim, you're not allowed to do eulogy and fasting. Right? So, and they're both forbidden, right? Both days, whether you live in a walled city or a non-walled city, right? Okay, so we'll do the Shulchan Aruch and we're done here. And tomorrow we'll start with the matzot. Oh my God. Okay, so we'll see what happens with that. Yeah. So it says in Shulchan Aruch, right? Mutar lisa isha bepurim. You're allowed to get married on Purim. You're allowed to marry. Right? Ben b'yud dalad ben b'tadvav. Whether it's 14th or 15th. V'kol shekin shemutar lasot b'pidyon ben. All the more so, says the Rama, you're allowed to do redemption of the firstborn, right? Okay, good luck. So now here's the fun part, right? Here's the real fun part. So says the Rama, what about wearing costumes on Purim, right? What's with that? Right? Are you allowed to wear costumes, or is it something silly or whatever? Like, are you doing like some kind of a Halloween or what? What's going on with that, right? So he says, "V'geber lovesh siblat isha ve'isha simin kili ve'geber." And then they also write dress up, men dress up as women and women as men. Any suba davar me'achar she'en mechavnin elav v'simcha be'alma. So it says the Rama, right? There's no prohibition. Can you imagine, right? He says, even a man as a woman or a woman as a man. Why is that? Because it's all for just fun, In other words, there's nothing, we're not like doing some kind of gender, right? Whatever, dysphoria, whatever it is that we call that stuff, right? We're not doing any of that stuff. So it's just, it's just for fun. So he says, therefore, right, wearing a costume on Purim is okay. So there's also something else. Also, he says, right, to wear kilaim, right, which is shatnez, wool and linen, which is only rabbinically forbidden. There are things which are also forbidden from the Torah. So if it says if it's only for rabbinically forbidden, it's okay. So he says some say it's forbidden to do these things, but he says the custom is like the first opinion. Also, he says, right, which we already mentioned before last week, that if they're like stealing from each other, all kinds of right, grabbing stuff one from the other, to play games with each other. On Purim, they say it's allowed, right? In other words, you're allowed to be a little bit silly on Purim, do some silly things like that. But we already said in the Bet Yosef, right, that the Bet Yosef didn't agree with that. He said it's not allowed to do that. But the Rama, right, the Ashkenazim are more lenient regarding this, So the Ashkenazim are a little bit more lenient when it comes to these things. But the Sfaradim, according to Bet Yosef, right, they're more stringent, and they don't. They don't allow to steal stuff, and grab something from your friend, right? Play practical jokes on him, all kinds of stuff like this, all kinds of things like this. So it says there's no prohibition regarding stealing, It says that's a custom. But he says they cannot do something interesting, right? Which is, like the leaders of the city don't agree to it. In other words, the chief people there, in the city, the rabbis or whatever, right? The leaders of the city, if they don't agree with it, they shouldn't do it. But if it's something which they're okay with it, that they allow to do some silly things, some silly stuff. So then, if they allow it, they can do it. That's what he's trying to say, right? Okay, very good. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll finish here. Bezrat Hashem. We'll start tomorrow with matzot, Bezrat Hashem, God willing. And so you can all make matzot at home, fresh, hot matzot every night. Fresh matzot, right? With no, so no compromises. You don't have to have crackers every night, right? Like most people have, right? You can have real soft matzot, with pita, bendable, right? The nice bendable and hot, sweet matzot. Okay, Bezrat Hashem. So we'll see you tomorrow. Chazak Baruch. Be blessed with wealth, health, happiness. Pray for the Jewish people, Bezrat Hashem, that are right. The army should be victorious, and Bezrat Hashem, and our hostages should be returned. Amen. Amen.
Called off. Thank you so much.
Chazak Baruch.